afternoon. My name is Johannes Tolderman. I am a board member of the Eritrean organization, Eritrean Assistant Organization in Chicago. So just a little bit review about our organization. So we started off from 2016. This is non-political, non-religious, non-ethnic groups. We are trying to bring Eritreans in Chicago, in the suburb area, together to work and to support each other in education, in tradition, and sport activities. So that is our small and humble community. And throughout the years, we have tried to invite people to help us with the workshops, training, and education. And even though we have started with small groups, now I think year by year we have able to gain some momentum, inviting so many people. We do summer sport programs, and at the same time we currently are having a Eritrean language in this building, and we have small initiative even to purchasing a house or a building for our community. So, and through this we invite all people, scholars, medical professionals to help us, to support us, to educate us in different fields. Now it is a pleasure meeting David through Timnit. Timnit did probably 2 years ago or 3 years ago in Italian colony in Eritrea, some small webinar. Now continuing on that, David I'm able to, David said he would accommodate us in giving us some lectures from his work. So I'm trying to just to say a few bio about David's work. David is an Eritrean visual artist, researcher, and educator. He completed an MFA in Visual Arts at the School of Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, a BFA in Photography at Concordia University, Montreal, a BA in History at the University of Saskatchewan. So it's hard to pronounce, in Saskatoon, and Independent Study Program at Museum in New York City. David is an associate professor in the Department of Photography at School of Art Institute of Chicago. He is represented by 2 galleries, Iwani Contemporary in London, UK, and Brandley Eritrean in Montreal, Canada. Sorry if I pronounce some of the words. I appreciate that. And as you know, Timnit has always been there. She's a PhD student at the Michigan University. So I would give this platform to David, and then we can continue. Okay, thank you so much.
I was telling Karen that I'm nervous in a way that I've done this before, but I'm nervous in a different way. So I'm really happy to be here, and it's an honor to be in the room with everyone. My thanks to Johnny and the Eritrean Assistance Organization in Chicago, but also to the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago's curators here, Karen Irvine, Asha back there, our amazing community engagement partners, team Salome and Salome Heather. So all of which to say this is a small, modest program, but there are a lot of people who are making, we're here to make this work. And I also want to thank Timnit for agreeing to do this talk with me. And I want to thank you all and welcome all of you who are here. So the title of this presentation is Prospetto a Mare, which literally translates to prospectus, to see, from Italian. And then you have this really long subtitle. I wanted you to have a sense of what I was going to talk about before you came to figure out if you were interested. So art, history, and Italian colonialism in the Horn of Africa through the lens of Chicago in the 1933 exposition. And only after I sent this to Johnny did I realize that I would have preferred to revise this title to not say the Horn of Africa. I would rather have it said North and East Africa, because I think part of what this project deals with is the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, but also Libya. So this is a mistake. And then the connection to Chicago and the 1933 was fair. So the purpose of the talk for me is really I want to introduce you to who I am. I want to introduce you to some of the ideas that I work with, some of the questions that inform what it is that I do, and to really think about the central question is how I deal with the question of history through this particular project. As Johnny said, I'm not a historian, but I studied history, and so that has been an important framework for how I do art. So the project is called Prospetto Mare. But I want to begin biographically. I was born in Asmara, then moved to Eritrea, Asmara to Ethiopia, from Ethiopia to Kenya, from Kenya to Sudan, London, England to Western Canada. And I know that this is a story that is familiar with many of us in this room, but it's important for me to articulate that for those of us who are familiar, and maybe for those of us who are not familiar, because it informs the type of questions that I engage in as an artist, and these lived experiences, what it means to move through cultural places, cultural frameworks that are not necessarily the ones with which you were born into. These are an important framework for the thinking that I do. So this biography, this being displaced, this moving around from place to place, has meant that I'm really interested in questions of what it means to be displaced, what it means to move voluntarily and non-voluntarily. We arrived in Canada in the early 80s, did my primary education, and then from 1998 to 1999, for 18 months, I went back to Eritrea and spent 18 months. And so that was a really formative period of time for me. It was the first time that I had gone back without my family. And then I returned again 10 years later in 2008. And now I go back every year. And so the opportunity to return to Eritrea continues to inform these questions that I'm talking about. So as I said, I studied history as an undergraduate. I then moved to studying photography, which my parents were thrilled about. And then from photography, I then came to the United States in 2004, where I continued to study, to complete my graduate studies in art. And so my work as an artist is, in many ways, oriented towards understanding and to informing myself of the histories that I've just described to you. So they're the narratives that my parents and members of my community had shared with me, and that gave me a particular understanding, but it became important for me to establish my own relationship, my own understanding of what these experiences are, but also to think about those narratives which were not communicated to me, and how I could develop a better understanding of those as an adult. I teach, I make art. And the central thread that connects both of those is how do I use art not just to make objects that are pleasing to look at, but how do I make objects, how do I make artistic experiences that will question, that will challenge people, that will inform people, and that will, dare I say, educate people. And so I am really committed to using art to raise questions, and fundamentally the person that I'm raising a lot of these questions for is myself, and then a broader community that emerges from there. So that's my education. My art, I work in a range of media. I make photographs, I make film, I make videos, I make sound work. So it really is a little bit of various types of artistic expressions. And I'm interested in that because it gives me a different flexibility to really think about, we come from a very oral culture. What does it mean to use orality in one work versus making photographs, which is a different sort of medium. So these kinds of decisions are at the heart of how and why I work expansively. So Prospetto Mare, as I said, and I show you, we begin with this map. Right? We begin with this Italian map, which re-anchors us back in the title. So Prospetto Mare questions and explores history, and specifically a history that I was not taught when I was young. I was not taught extensively when I was young, which is the history of Italian colonialism. We left in the middle of a difficult set of circumstances, the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and that was the overwhelming, my knowledge and experience that was imparted for me. It was very much rooted in that experience. And so a lot of this work for me is an attempt to understand those events in a much deeper historical framework. So Prospetto Mare, as I said, explores history, the history of Italian colonialism in North and East Africa. But there are a number of motivating factors that inform this particular project, and I would like to share just a few of them with you. What I will show you today, Prospetto Mare is an ongoing exploration. I've been doing this work and doing this research actively since about 2010. So around 2010, 11, 12, I was being mindful of the type of stories that were circulating in Western media, and specifically around how people from North Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia were making their way into Italy. And there was a way in which that narrative, to me, did not consider these deeper historical connections. And so it was this absence, this gap of a certain context that became interesting to me. And so it culminated in 2013 with, this tragic deaths of many lives within sight of Lampedusa, within sight of Libya. Sorry, within sight of Lampedusa. So migrant ship that had left Lampedusa, that had left Libya, making its way to Italy, and within sight of the Italian shores, it crashed, collapsed. There's a fire, and then over 300 people lost their lives. Many of them were from the countries I've just mentioned. And so this event, and the way in which photography and images and language were used to talk about that particular event, but other migrations across the Mediterranean from Libya into Italy began to interest me. And part of what I was compelled by was, so if you look at the title of this image here, and for those of you who can't read it, it says, African refugees on a crowded boat 25 miles from the Libyan coast. When I was looking at this image from 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, I was spending a significant amount of time in Italy, and specifically a small city on the Sicilian coast called Catania, where there was a large population of migrants from Eritrea, Ethiopia, right, from these places. And what was interesting to me was the way in which this kind of a language, African refugees, threw everybody into this very undifferentiated mess. If you zoom into these kinds of photographs and you look carefully, you recognize that there are Tigrinya speakers. You recognize that you begin to recognize different groups. Tigrinya, Tigray, Tigray. You recognize people from Sudan. You recognize people from Somalia. But there's a a way in which this kind of, this kind of language and then this kind of image, which just lumps everybody together, acts to deny particular histories. So these sorts of images began to interest me. We fast forward to 2022 with the rise of Maloney and the return of the right wing in Italy. But what was happening and what I was witnessing in Italy 14, 15, 16, 17 was an inhospitable environment when it came to immigrants and refugees. And specifically, there was a way in which the interaction between Italians and people from our part of the world were being treated as though we didn't know each other. Right? We were treated as though we were strangers to Italians. They didn't know who we were, they didn't know where we were coming from. And it was this kind of a denial of history, an inability to recognize that there was a significant period of time where Italians occupied North and Northeast Africa, which was not part of the consciousness. And then the other thing is, from 1876 to 1976, the largest migration in modern times was of Italians. Not only to various parts of Africa, but to North America, to Central America, to Australia. And so the historical irony of Europe now being unwelcoming to refugees, specifically from these parts of the world, when the nation that is now the gate had sent so many people who in their own time were fleeing difficult circumstances, economic, political, cultural. That historical irony became something that was significant for me to think about. I explained to you that from 2014-15 up to 19, I was spending a great deal of time in Catania. And so there's a lot of work that I produced working with a number of, and there were 10 young Eritreans that I was working with in Catania, making photographs, making videos, all kinds of work. Their lives in Italy were extraordinarily difficult. Difficult to go to school, difficult to work, and so it was just this killing time. And what many of them ended up doing was having to make the difficult decision of leaving Italy to try their luck elsewhere. And so it meant leaving Italy, flying to Ecuador, from Ecuador, making their way up through Central America, being arrested at the US border, and then some of them would make their way into Canada. So I was in Montreal when, and this is post-2016, after the unnamed one comes to power. And there is a number of individuals and communities who think that they're about to be deported, so many of them begin to cross the Canadian border, the American-Canadian border. Some of those same individuals were some of the 10 young Eritreans that I was working with in Catania. And so these histories, and where are they coming to? Montreal. And in Montreal, I'm doing the research of Italians who have migrated to Montreal, to Canada. And so it became necessary for me to think about these histories connect with each other. How do I explore them? In 1933, the Chicago World's Fair, a gathering of nations from around the world, this incredibly sort of enormous event. Central to that event was a transatlantic flight. And so you had a squadron, 25 Italian pilots left on these seaplanes, and they left the little place you see, Orbitello, and made a number of stops in various locations. Reykjavik, Cartwright in Canada, so across the Atlantic, Shediac Bay, New Brunswick, Montreal, Canada, and then arrived in Chicago for the 1933 World Fair. So this was a very important transatlantic historical flight. This kind of long-distance flight with this many flights had never been done before. It had never been done before, And so it was met with incredible fanfare. This was a significant event. So this technology, the way in which the 1933 fair celebrated, let me back up, this flight was led by a general who was called Italo Balbo. So Balbo was number 2 to Mussolini, right? The former governor of Libya, very powerful in the hierarchy of Italy's fascist government. So and the minister of the Air Force. So he's the one who leads the squadron. And so he leads the squadron that arrives in Chicago. And he is celebrated, and the event itself is celebrated for what it demonstrates about Western notions of progress, the development of technology, the airplane as an indicator of what it means to be a modern contemporary subject in the world, what it means to conquer distance, what it means to conquer the elements. And so airplanes and this idea of celebrating airplanes as an important and radical revolutionary technology was something that was important to how this event was celebrated at the World's Fair. So that's one dimension of it, right? That's one dimension of it. But it's also important to recognize, to go back to the colonial dimension, that this story is also being used to support Italy's colonial endeavors within the context of North Africa and East Africa. So there needs to be a difference between, there needs to be a way to rationalize and to justify what is being done colonially. And part of that is anchored on the airplane as the signifier of progress, as I said earlier. And so I'm really invested through this project in developing a better understanding of what it means to build a certain colonial imagination. If the airplane becomes a symbol of progress, surely there has to be a symbol of non-progress that opposes it. If the airplane is a symbol of technology and civilization, there has to be something that is the opposite to that. And so it's the way in which these kinds of oppositions are set up is an important question for me. So when I say that this was a wildly sort of celebrated and heralded event, we see in this photograph here the unveiling of the monument. And so the monument is so this is the monument that I'm specifically alluding to here. So we see behind the Italian National Pavilion in the shape of an airplane and with an awning from an actual airplane on top of it. So that language of progress, that language of technology exists not just in the technology itself, but also in architecture. And so I'm interested in what it is that what kind of a legacy these forms have left in Chicago. And for those of us who've been in Aspara, I think we know what the other building is. Sorry? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The Fiat Tagliero. So I have this buried somewhere in the end if we want to look at it. And so I live and I work in Chicago. And I ride by this monument. So the Balbo Monument this is a 2,000-year-old column. After this event, Mussolini sends this as a gift to the city of Chicago to honor friendship between the city and to honor friendship between Italy and the United States. And it sits on this column. It sits on this column. And so this is, if you look at it, is location-wise, behind it was the National Pavilion of Italy. Right? So this is where we are today. That's a part of my accent. That's part of my tone. That's what the plane sounded like. When I arrived to Chicago and began to seek out this monument, it was an incredibly, it was a hard monument for me to find, even using the GPS. Part of it is where it currently sits, sort of Vernon Park, between the park and Lake Michigan. But it's surrounded by trees. So it's a difficult monument to miss. And there's something really metaphorically powerful about the fact that this monument that I'm trying to find requires a certain amount of looking. And so I go back and I go back and I go back, and part of what I've been interested in with this monument is the way in which ordinary citizens walk by this thing, unaware of what it is that it symbolizes, right? Or unaware of what it symbolizes beyond its relationship to technology and advances of technology. So the other monument to me is what was formerly 7th Avenue in Chicago has been made Balboa Avenue. So ordinary Chicagoans walk across this street on a daily basis or ride by that monument without an understanding of these international histories of colonialism that I'm alluding to. And so part of what I'm invested in these locations and what they represent is really sort of thinking about what role they play as markers of memory in facilitating what kind of an attitudes towards, in facilitating particular attitudes towards the past. And as formulations of certain, as formulations of particular memories, it's what are the things that they represent that continues to exist? What are the things that they represent that has shifted? And what do we do with these things? Right? It's like, what do we do with these objects? I was describing earlier when I said that the construction of technology and modernism and modernity as a tool of progress has to have an antithesis. And so, as much as I'm looking at that flight that I've just shown you from Orbitello, Bellarado, to Chicago, I'm also really interested in the Italian national airline, which was called Alla Vittoria under the period around the French. And so it flew all over Europe, flew from Europe to Libya, from Libya to Eritrea, Ethiopia. So it connected both Europe within itself, but it also connected Europe, Italy to the colonies, and then connected the colonies themselves. So these were actual advertisements that were used in the pages of the Alatoria magazines, right? So that's what you see here. And the language is very interesting, where we have the airplane, and this tool is always elevated. So we have this kind of a split, right? The ground, the sky, the ground, the sky, the ground, the sky. And then this explicit sort of articulation in that last image where we see, this is the African, this is me. And this is the airplane. So that sense of what it is to have a subject that is outside of history, that is outside of civilization, is what gives this thing its particular charge. And so it's unpacking that kind of a ideological sort of work is what is of interest to me. So while the airplane is celebrated in one context, it's also a tool of war in another context. And so specifically, I'm interested in the way in which it is part of, say, the invasion of Ethiopia, the invasion of Libya. Like the first bombs that are dropped from an airplane are in Libya by, using the technology of the airplane. This is the exact same airplane. And the exact same plane, the Savoia Marchetti, the same engine that Balboa was using to get to Chicago. And so the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the Second World War, this usage of this technology becomes an important thing for me to interrogate. Part of what is extremely important for me and why I'm really happy for us to be able to have this conversation here is, this is you can get this online, 2022, Chicago Monuments Project released this report that looked at the really problematic monuments, public monuments that are in Chicago, and raises the questions of what it is that is to be done with them. And it's an important set of considerations. But part of what was missing for me were these kinds of, was conversations between certain communities didn't happen. So the racial dimension that looks at these really difficult monuments in relationship to things, histories of slavery, histories of settler colonialism, anti-indigenous sort of genocide in North America is absolutely crucial. But I also think that if these questions and these monuments, and specifically I'm saying that the Italo-Babel monument, can begin to encompass communities in Libya, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, who are living in Chicago, I think that we have a more expanded and complicated conversation about what it is that these projects, that these monuments are. And in many ways for me, that's how I'm envisioning what this Prospetto Mare is as a project. There are various elements within what I'm attempting to do, and when I say what I'm attempting to do, me in a conjunction with a whole bunch of institutions. So it will culminate in an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Columbia College in September 2024. That's one part of it. There is a publication with a number of scholars who look at questions of history, who look at questions of art and art history, who look at questions of memory, and they all contribute to a publication that will live long after the exhibition. Right? And writers from Chicago, from Italy, from Eritrea. And then the third part of it is, for me, is this public engagement and community engagement part of it, which are publications, discussions that will culminate in other events, tours, workshops that build on the conversations that happen in these particular contexts. So there are a number of communities and community associations and institutions that are part of this conversation. So you see here the Eritrean Assistance Organization where we are today, the Ethiopian Community Association of Chicago, the Italian Cultural Institute. So it really is the Eritrean diaspora, Italians in Chicago, Italian Americans in Chicago, the Ethiopian diaspora, the Somali diaspora, the Libyan diaspora. Right? So that the conversation can be much more expansive in terms of understanding and recognizing what it means to interrogate the history of Italian colonialism, which does not receive the same kind of analysis and focus, even by the Italians. In the contemporary moment. And then the final part of it is that there are a range of partnering institutions, Uptown Gallery, Marion Ibrahim Gallery, where events will be staged in order to really sort of think about. I was not raised going to art as a young Eritrean, and so there are these art institutions within the cities that I grew up in that always felt foreign to me. And so part of what I think we're attempting to do through this project is to think about how do we expand and complicate the idea of what the museum is. So the exhibition is at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, but what we do with an advisory board, with all of our partnering institutions, is think about what it means to go to a community, to have a set of conversations there, to go to another community, to have a set of conversations there, to repeat that process. And then to program a series of events and activities that can scaffold on top of one another in a way that allows the museum and the cultural space itself to grow. A significant amount of my own history as an Eritrean, I'm learning by accessing materials that are in other institutions, that are in archives, outside of Eritrea. And so this is a small portion, right? This is a small portion of archives that I've been accessing while in Chicago. So the work, it's too much work to look at, but the work of informing myself about the work is really anchored on the type of information and historical documents that sit in all of these places. And the struggle as an artist then becomes, how do you take these historical documents, transform them somehow, make them do a different kind of work than they're originally intending to do, and then resituate them, put them in different places. And I think this is a good place. This is a great example of what I mean. Right? Take photographs that were intended to present subjects from North and East Africa in a very particular way, extract that photograph, and then put it on a different ground so that the ground itself, so this is like a painting, right, a screen print, and the two materials come together. So really thinking about transformation, really thinking about transforming materials. I think that that's a good place to start.
I'll ask him a few questions, but the most important part is your comments and your questions. So just be ready after our short conversation to, to start talking and having a discussion with us. Okay? I'm going to be on this side though. Okay. Right in front of them. Maybe here. Okay.
This is good. We're speaking across the
also with you. Yeah. So. This is really an honor for me to speak with Dawi. I met him a year ago and was just so happy and proud to learn about his work because what you've done, Dawi, is you've put our history and our culture, you've put it on a world stage, and exhibiting his work all over the world. So it's a really, I think, a point of pride for me and for us to be learning more about you and talking with you today. So thank you so much. As you all know, I think you introduced me earlier. My name is Sunette. From Chicago, I grew up here. Very proud to be from Chicago, but also very proud to be Eritrean. So that's why this project, this exhibition, really joins so many things for me, and I think so many of us in this room join so many parts of our own histories and identities. And I think it's important, to delve deeper. As you mentioned, Dawi, it's not so common when you're growing up as an Eritrean, especially in the diaspora, to see people working as artists. We're often pushed into fields like, doctor, engineer, those kinds of things. So I'm sure it wasn't easy for you to pursue this kind of career, but you did, and you've done it brilliantly. So why was it important for you to go in that direction, even though, of course, it must have been difficult or uncommon and you didn't see anyone like you, but you still did it. Why was it important for you to do that? And also, why is it important for more Eritreans to be involved in the art space, in the cultural field? Why is it important for us to do that?
Well, the first part of it, yeah, it's the instability that my parents had is what they didn't want us to have, right? And so the focus for them was to come to North America so that we could get an education and to use that education to do something stable, the careers as you've said. And I tried that, I tried that out of a sense of familial responsibility, out of a sense of wanting to honor the sacrifices that my parents had made. It didn't it was not something that, it didn't make me happy. That's the first thing. Secondly, I grew up in a house where there was so much culture. Stories were always being told. There were always visual materials in the place. There was always music. So I understood the importance of culture. It was there. What was difficult was to find a place for my own exploration of these interests in a way that would initially lead my parents to freaking out. You know, like the third part of it was the most difficult thing. I always say the most difficult thing that I dealt with, up until a certain point, was getting my parents. I didn't need them to understand, because what I was trying to do was a little difficult. I simply needed them to support what it was that I was doing. And once they saw me committed in doing the thing that I loved, it was, it's just been. And the final part of it is, if we don't tell our story, somebody else is going to. Right? So I was raised with this idea that art is a luxury, that you take care of certain basics, and then if you have the luxury of money, if you have the luxury of resources, then you can engage with these things. But I don't think that art is a luxury. I don't think that culture is a luxury. I think that it's an absolute necessity. And so I knew from a very early point when I was moving towards art, the stories that I needed to tell. And it was driven by a need to walk into a cultural space and to see my own reflection in a manner that I recognized it. And so I think it's really, really urgent that within the context of our communities, that we participate in these conversations, that we encourage our children to participate.
It also sounds like, just from your presentation as well, that art is a tool. It helps you understand something, and for you, that historical element is really important. As a historian and studying history in grad school, or really any part of your formal education in the U.S. or anywhere else, I say in exile, you don't hear anything about Eritrea at all, right? Not a single thing. Even if you seek it out, right? Talking to your professors and mentors, they can't even help you. They can't point you to any, resources. So it's really difficult to do historical work. We have limited documentary sources. We have limited historiography, which means there's just so little to reference in terms of books and sources. So with traditional historical methods, it's really hard to tell these kinds of stories to understand our history better. But you use art to do that. So tell me more about that method, right? How does the aesthetic process let you see and understand our history differently?
Part of it is, that list of materials, that list of archives that I shared, the list of archives that I shared. Part of, and this was the training, studying history was incredibly useful for me, was giving me an understanding of how do you spend time in an archive finding materials, because it's not as straightforward as we would think, right? There are key terms that you have to have an understanding of. There is terminology that groups things as funds, right? There's a way in which the archive is set up to privilege a very particular understanding. So part of the initial aspect of my education was understanding these things. Where is this material? How do you access this material? How do you talk your way in order to be able to get this information? And then the second part of it, in terms of, I said earlier, I think about what it is that I'm doing as a researcher, as an artist. Like, I don't have answers. I'm good at asking a whole bunch of questions. Because one of the things that all of these archives that I learned when I look at all of these repositories of information, is that somebody has made a selection out of a much bigger selection because they deem this important, and so they've collected this for a particular reason. So this is left out, that is left out, that is left out, that is left out. So when you talk historical methodology, part of my interest is in understanding how I'm always dealing with these very partial, small things. The big I don't have the capacity to make these big historical claims. So that's the historical methodology. The third part of it is, I'm an artist. So part of what I have to do is take this material and put it through a very particular transformational process. I have to change it somehow. I have to change it once, I have to change it twice, and then I have to change it 3 times, and then I put it out into the world for people to engage with. Part of what that process, part of what art does for me when I do these kinds of things, it gives me the understanding of how you can understand that historical material differently. Does that make sense? But I want to come back to the thing that you said earlier, which is, I'm always shocked when I meet somebody who knows anything about Eritrea. Right? It's always, I'm always shocked. And because we exist at the edge of most people's consciousness. But we come from a particular part of the world that is geographically, geopolitically as important as any other place in the world. And so part of my responsibility, I think I said this to you before, I make the work in the exhibition that I wanted to walk into when I was young. So that's my relationship to history, and that's my relationship to artistic process. Is I'm making work that I didn't get to see, I'm addressing questions that I didn't get to hear, and it comes back to that sense of being responsible for it. It's one thing for me to complain about the fact that we are overlooked, but I also think that that complaint comes with a responsibility, which is, then what are we going to do with the privilege of education, with the privilege of being able to be an artist? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I mean, I'm seeing, like, with this this exhibit that, you know, I hope everyone comes to see it in September. The exhibit will open in September. But, you know, focusing on that Balbo monument, which was so interesting because, yes, I've never noticed it as well, but it carries so much of our history, right? And it's celebrating, and I'll just state it again, maybe some who weren't here earlier, celebrating Italo Balbo's transatlantic flight, right? And he's Mussolini's second hand, right? Second lieutenant man. So it's celebrating, right, the technology of the airplane, modernity, progress, all of those things. But we know that those technologies were also used in violent ways, right, to colonize not just Eritrea, other parts, right, of Africa as well. So from the perspective of the colonies, of colonized people, it may not be as celebratory as a connotation, right, this transatlantic flight. I'm thinking also of, there's a novel called The Conscript, which I know you know, Dawit, but The Conscript was recently translated into English from Tigrinya, and it was written by Gabriel Susailu, who wrote this novel in 1927. So one of the very first novels ever written in any African indigenous language. And he follows this main character, Tukwabo, who's an Askari, who's a part of the colonial army, and traveling from, you know, Asmara to Badr, to the coast, to go to Libya, right, to fight in this war. And he describes some of these technologies, right, of transportation, very vividly, you know, and there's the one scene on the train station that haunts me. I don't know if you remember that scene, but he's describing all these young Eritrean men getting onto these trains, these steam locomotives, a very chaotic scene with mothers wailing and, you know, Italian carabinieri beating, you know, people away. And he calls these trains roaring lions, right? They are there to devour young Eritrean men, describing the trucks, right, as part of the journey that are carrying young Eritrean men into the depths of hell, right? So you see these different connotations of these kinds of technologies. So if we there, they celebrated this flight, right? American imperialists, Italian fascists, right? They're celebrating this. If we decenter them and center us, say, right, or formerly colonized people, what would be an alternative reading? What kinds of alternative readings emerge of this flight?
Yeah. And that is at the heart of the questions that I'm grappling with. Right? That's why for me, for us to be gathered here, and I see that this is a transgenerational audience in here. So there are different familiarities and remembrances that we have of what the Italian colonial period was, subsequent to that, the British administration, American, right? Like we understand that there were all of these particular phases that we've gone through. But my specific interest in that particular, in that particular history, the Italian dimension of it is, there was a real brutality to it. There was a real brutality to the Italian colonial dimension that escapes scrutiny, and part of it is because the Italians have done an excellent job of not looking at it. Right? Making it difficult to access the archives, making it difficult to access the materials. And where a book like, The Conscript becomes incredibly powerful is we have a Tigrinya voice, an Eritrean voice, at that moment, who is able to offer their unique vantage point on what these technologies, the work that these technologies are actually doing, and who it is that they're cannibalizing. So I began this whole thing by saying that there are a couple of motivating factors, and the motivating factors for me is that the Mediterranean is a graveyard, right? And it's a graveyard in many young, and here I would not just say about Eritrea to give it, I'll say many Africans are in the Mediterranean. And when you're in Lampedusa and you see the, the tombstones, and some of them don't have names. Like the history that, sorry, I need a minute. What the writer in the Conscript is addressing is replaying itself out. And so, to do this kind of historical work for me is really about saying, we have to look at the brutalities that were taking place historically in order to understand how and where we fit into it. So that it's, I'm using history, but to really sort of think about what continues to happen in different ways. Forgive me. So yeah, and I think the other thing that I would add to that, to that text is, in 1890, there was about the author's journey, this publication. So there's the Conscript, but I hope that I don't know if anybody's familiar with this history, but it's like this is the first travelogue, the first autobiography, the first travelogue autobiography written in an indigenous African language, and it's Fissahagadis, who spends 5 years in Italy. Brilliant, part of the cultural milieu. He's teaching rhetoric. He's teaching various intellectual circles, but he's not a part of the historical record. This entire project, this is that other motivating factor that I didn't discuss. It was going to search for Fissahagadis in Italy that brought up, it was an inability to find his existence in the historical records. That is what motivated a lot of this work. So it leads from Fissahagadis to the Conscript to this contemporary moment, as you say, where our history just is at the edge of many people's consciousness. experience, the effects of the Italian colonial are all over Italy. The street names, the building names, the cafes, Eritrean Cafe, right, like, so it is in the built environment. You know, it is in the built environment. But what happened after the Italian colonial project was different from the British or the French because it wasn't an indigenous push that forced them out. Right? So the Italians lose to the British. So they haven't had to confront the post-colonial moment in the same way that the British or the French or the Portuguese, etc. have had. And so part of what happened is that once Italy shifted from Axis power supporting Germany and Japan, overnight it became a vessel of the United States. And so that history, right, and so we've killed Mussolini, fascism is over, done. Well, where did all of those repositories and all of those archives go? They've just been made difficult to access. So the direct response to your question is that it was not until the late 70s where some Italian scholars, mainly some heroic Italian scholars, like the gentleman in Boca, Angelo de Boca, who initiated this process, and we have to look at these questions. And so this has started happening. This reckoning has begun to happen, but it is not something that has happened voluntarily. And so I see the work that I'm trying to do as being part of what it means for those of us who are on that boat to come to Italy, and what are the unexplored histories of the colonial encounter that have not been dealt with, or have not been narrated from an Eritrean perspective. The Italians may have a particular view of it. The other question of it for me is how do we think about it? Where does this experience lie in our own consciousness? So it's not just about keeping, as you said to me, it's not about keeping the Italians at the center of this. It really is about looking at it from different perspectives, different voices. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I think anyone who's been to Barcelona knows that the legacy of Italian architecture is everywhere. And it really shapes how people speak about the city, the things they'll say about it, phrase it. And I'm curious how you think sort of excavating this new history or reclaiming this history will change how people interact with the built environment there. And subsequently, you have the slide about the further projects you're working on. I remember one of them was sort of, interacting with Italian communities and Italian American communities. So I'm also curious, what reaction do you anticipate from them?
Yeah. I said earlier that I was nervous about, even a conversation amongst ourselves. These aren't easy histories. Right? These aren't easy histories. And so, I don't know, but my sense of the Italian-American relationship to the monument as I've understood it is one that wants to look at it as a point of pride. And I understand that. Right? Italians have a very particular, they didn't come here rich, right? They came here and had to become an American in a way that, they were at the bottom of the heap so I don't want to be oblivious to how this monument, or the Columbus monument, or the various monuments that I work with, how they are read differently and understood differently. But what I'm hoping is that interpretation can leave room for what happens is, to me, says if this other consideration can exist sort of at the same, beside it. Not to trump it out and say that this is what it absolutely means. So, in short, I hope that they will engage. That's my first thing. Right? I hope that they will engage. Because in response to the question that you posed earlier, how shocking it was for me to spend time in Italy and they have no clue. When I say to them I'm Eritrean, it means nothing to them. Or when here I'm with Italian Americans and I say that I grew up in a house where my parents both fluent Italian. Doesn't make sense. But the reality is, I mean, has anyone here, by show of hands, been at this monument? So it's 4 of us. You see, so my hope is that the conversation is not just with Italian Americans or the Italians. I'm hoping that the conversation for me is more comprehensive, but I recognize that as you know, it brings up difficult things. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think you've given us an angle to see from an artistic way of seeing things. I would see this one, and I wouldn't read. I would read it, but I wouldn't read it. You know, the message, the longer and deeper message. And so, thank you for your expertise, and then for presentation, and then for the long historical kind of view also presented in information. My question is, how can we use your study as well as whatever we are doing today redemptively? I'm just backing up on her question. It's going to be presented beyond, okay, you tell to Eritreans, this is part of your history, and then it has been problematic. Work out. But if we are going to be doing it in partnership with other communities, like the Italians who were on the other side of, on the opposite side of things to say. So how can we bring that redemptive concept and make us work together to make the narration even has a good ending or kind of be productive?
Yeah.
Instead of just knowing history, learning out of history, making today an effort for tomorrow's better future.
Yeah, thank you. Those are big questions. Those are big questions. But when you say redemptive, when you say redemptive history, I think I understand what you mean, but I have to think about if that's what I'm not sure that history is necessarily a redemptive sort of space for me. But that aside, the contradictions, the complexities, the challenges that are happening within this historical series of events, I don't see this as something that is behind us. So I think the only revision that I would make is that I may be using historical materials or a historical lens, but I think that the problems, the things that I'm thinking about in terms of socially, politically, are contemporary. Right? Who is moving where, under what circumstances? What kinds of stories arrive at a place about a people before they arrive? Who gets access to move into a particular place? Who tells which story? Who narrates which story, to use your word? I believe that these are still questions that we're grappling with today. And so my hope in the conversation that brings the various communities together, as you've said, in different ways, right? That brings communities in different ways, is to do the thing that Tanit alluded to earlier, is to say, what is our understanding of a particular event? How do we expand it? How do we complicate it? Because I think our tendency frequently is we want the simple, clear solution. We want it neat and tidy. But these things are messy. So how do we begin to create interactions that allow some of this messiness not necessarily to be resolved, but just to be presented? So that is one facet of it. But the other facet of it is, I go back to your analysis of it, the art thing is, I want us to, as a community, it's like these cultural institutions, when you say to me, it's like, my responsibility is doing some of this work. But there's a shared responsibility. And the shared responsibility is for us to go, and when I say us, I mean you, in this instance, because we're speaking. This material is here for all of us to go and to explore. How will you reposition it? Who are you going to represent this material? Who are they going to reposition it with? So I think that there's a way in which the conversation is not just about the communities that we bring together through the MOCP, the various institutions that I've indicated, but it's, I think, all of us as individuals in this room. So that for me is the work, what I hope.
Thank you. My name is Mare. Thank you all for the presentation and me. This is part of our history. So my question is, our grandfathers, they fought with Italian in Turkey and Libya. There were so many things. They sacrificed their lives. We lost so many things. Also, Italian, for their benefit, they built some infrastructure, houses in Mare or whatever other cities. For example, in Eritrean and Mare, those who fought with Italian, they put in their grave unknown soldier. In contrast, there is so many places they reserve for their spaces, for their graves in Mare, even in Italy. So, do you think as an artist, the Italian colony, they do so many things virtual, raised in Eritrea. Do you think to recur or collect the material, those Italians did so many bad things in Eritrea, to transfer the real story or image? It's open for public, can get any material is open, or they hide some information. Number two question. What can be done to transfer the truth, the Italian, what they did in Mare, in Eritrea, and those who lost their lives, Eritrean soldiers, they fought against Ethiopians, against British, but they don't get anything. In reality, we need compensation from Italy, but we never did. Okay? In contrast, Ethiopia, they brought some art from British, from Italian, they returned some materials. Do you think they took some important material from Eritrea or not?
I think you know the answer to that last one. Right? But I think two things. The first thing is, so earlier when I was describing that access to Italian archives has come slowly. Because the people who remain in power after the transfer, once Italy's policy shifts towards Americans, is that the people who controlled the archives were the very people who had controlled them, right, who were coming from the colonial spaces. And so part of what has happened in Italy is that those archives were carefully controlled by a particular. Those archives were controlled by interests for whom the colonial experience was not, they didn't want it known. I hope that I'm not speaking in vain, right? But I just mean, so when we say that it's not until the 70s that these questions of Italy as a colonial power begin to emerge, it's not until the 70s. so part of that has been 2012, 2013, this enormous Italian Orientale d'Africa archive, they shut it down. Anyone know what I'm talking about here? Yeah, so it's like, yeah, they shut it down. And the argument was, we don't have resources. But it fit into, if you look at it historically, it fit into a pattern of not wanting to look at these historical pushes against knowledge. So, but that is changing. Right? That is slowly changing. Firstly. Secondly, a lot of this material is in places that are not Italian. So when I showed you all of these archives in Chicago, a lot of this material about Italian colonialism is here. But do you know where else I access a lot of this material? On eBay. Our history I buy on eBay. Because there's an entire market for postcards, manuscripts. Right? This image that I've just shown you, this. So there are different ways of accessing information, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? But the second question is, and I'm very happy that you've asked it, because that's the complicated question, is, yes, we were conscripted into Italian armies, and we fought against other Africans. Like, that's a historical, right? So it's, and sacrificed enormously. Huge numbers of Eritreans. Lost limbs, lost lives, and very few were compensated after by Italy. But part of that is because the denial, ignoring that history of we were never the colonizers, or Prospetto, right? We were the good colonizers. We built roads, we built schools, we built but it leaves the other part of the story out. So the idea is, well, we don't owe you anything. We've already paid you, now you can leave. The story, right? So it means, if you look at the question of repatriation, and I think as Eritreans we have an enormous amount to learn about what is happening in other parts of Africa who are insisting that their cultural materials be repatriated back to them. So unless we can create the awareness of what the experiences and encounters were and what was taken, how do we know what to ask for? But all you have to do is go to the museums in Rome. You know, these objects that I've never seen are all there. So that idea of, I think that there is a lot, you know, I think that there's a lot to repatriate. Which comes back to the question that we were saying before. There was an understanding and there was a valuing of these cultural objects in the first place, which is why they were taken. So unless we have the same sense of understanding that these cultural objects are of value, then they just stay in either private collections or in museums. Did I answer your question?
So is the case the same in all the other colonized countries, such as Libya and Egypt? Is the story the same?
Well, I think this is where there are the way and there are people in here who know these histories better than I do, and I'd be happy to hear from them. But I just need to say that there is our relationship to Italians as their first colony is different from Ethiopia, from Somalia, from Libya. So I'm not an expert on the absolute state of where the current relationships are. But what I will say is that the overall experience of denying, right? The experience of denying the overall experience, the overall colonial sort of encounter and its problematic is a little bit different in different contexts. That image that you saw of the airplane, you know, on the right, this is Italians dropping mustard gas, you know, in northern Ethiopia. long did that take to come out? The concentration camps and the killing of Libyans. That took a long time for these stories sort of to come out. So I just mean to say that there have been specific events that, so Libyans have a particular negotiation of that, of these colonial histories that is a little bit different than the Somalis, that is different than us. So I don't want to paint a flat, uniform experience or response forward is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, do you have plans to create a documentary? I mean, the one thing we lack is documentary from the locals' perspective. And do you have any plans to create documentary?
What's your name?
Tamil.
Tamil. To me, this is a part, this is that. That's what this is. Right? That's what this is. So, the archives, the historical documents that I'm looking at, I think about this as creating archives. This is being recorded. All of our meetings that we have as advisors, all of that is recorded. So these questions and these conversations that we're having are producing historical material. And from a particular set of perspectives. Right? From a particular set of perspectives. So I see this as part of that work, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thank you, Doug and Cindy, for organizing, for doing all this. My name is Sally. I grew up in Karen, and so actually I live very close to this place. They call it Tincolahas. Tincolahas is, I think, there's just a lane. They call it Tincolahas. Basically, I mean, I don't know how to translate, but the two superpowers basically they kill each other and then they die in a big number. They call it Talahiso or something like that. That's the meaning of it. And then we used to play, and then they have a monument and a big headstone of one general. I think the main general was passed that died in that. And then when he died, the British, they managed to control the place, and then after that, the war I think ended. That was the biggest war what happened among the superpowers at that time. And then I heard that monument and the headstone. His daughter came back recently, and then she renovated. I think she built it, erected, and then so the idea is even there's like a well, a big well, and then they were getting water and then put it on the hip part, and then the water was going basically supplying all the soldiers, and then a lot of people, of course, Eritreans and then other people died. Of course, the British they have the Indians and the British one. So my question is like it's good to have like it's good to see history from perspective, because there's a saying, there's a proverb, the African proverb, they call it the past is our head and then the future is our hands. So the past is past, we can go back and do everything. But it's good to see it from West perspective, from Eritrean perspective, and also from Italian perspective. Do you create any collaboration with the scholars, Italians and Eritreans, maybe from Libya like that? Do you have that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that I used to think as an artist that everything culminated in this exhibition. Exhibition happens and then it finishes and then it's done. This for me now is the framework for what an art project, as I envision it, are. Okay, so these are the things. And so the question you're asking is this.
Yes.
And so I've been very fortunate, right? So this project that we're doing with the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago is funded by the Terra Foundation of American Art. And part of the support that we were able to secure is for publication. And the publication brings brilliant scholars from Italy, from Eritrea, from Turkey, right? From Turkey. Some were based in Chicago, some were based in New York, some were based in Italy, the previous one, right? So it's what is really important, And this comes back to the question that I was saying before, that these projects are not just about making art, they're also about producing material, source books. So that's what this is. So the publication for this will have all of these authors. Karen Irvine, who's the curator, will write a text about the exhibition. And then all of these various scholars will write about a different set of ideas or issues that the work or elements in the exhibition deal with. So the publication is one part of it, but then there will be a symposium. And this comes back to Timothy's point, is that this for me is what it says. So yes, we are at the edge of conversations, so how do we center these things? So the exhibition is one thing, community engagement in this manner is another thing. To have a publication that will circulate around the world, that will be unsyllabi, is another part of it. So that is a hugely, hugely important part of it. And the people who write these are real scholars, right? So that is a significant, significant part of it. Yeah.
I'm glad to see that. That's what you said.
Yeah. But the event that was alluded to is one of the most significant battles in World War II happened just outside of Quebec, where the tide of war really shifted, where the British and the Italians had this enormous sort of conflict. But again, to come back to this point, that it's like, but who knows about this, right? That this was an incredibly seminal event in history. But
I think maybe we can take one more if there's one more question. Is that right, Johnny? And then we're going to go downstairs? Okay.
yeah, make me look better.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mike.
Okay.
So I am one part of the board with John, and thank you to meet, and John for hard place for this day. And really, I mean, it's beyond what I expect. It's really important. It's important to be here. And my question is still, I grew up in Asmara, so like, I mean, it's great to be multilingual, bilingual, I understand that, Italian, but still, we are proud. Still, if you can one word Italian, you are better than other one than Italian. And still, why is that kind, I mean, we're still proud that we were on a line, or just because we don't know what's happened, just speaking the language or the word, Italian words, even one word makes you feel better than other than who doesn't speak Italian. I mean, what's that exactly? Why? And my second question is, I mean, this kind of important information, how you can tell other Eritreans here or around the United States, I mean, this kind of to make them know exactly what we can do. That's my question.
Yeah. Can we go back to the first question? I want to understand it a little bit better.
Okay. Oh, my first question is still, I mean, growing up, especially in the capital city, Asmara,
Yeah.
if you speak, some words of Italian, you feel like better than anyone. Still exists this kind of character.
I think I understand.
It's good to be multilingual or know other languages,
Yeah.
but still exists until I believe still
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
Neither one of my parents were educated, but they both spoke fluent Italian. Right? They both spoke amazing. So I grew up with a source of pride in that. And not only Italian, but they spoke, 6, 7. Is that the phone? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was transported. That was an important source of pride for me, because I understood it as So that sense of pride that my parents could, in particular contexts, speak to people who were not expecting Italian to come out of these people's mouths, that did it. So that sense of pride that you're articulating, I understand. And because the language gives you access and entry point and inclusion and participation in a particular thing. So it's not, I have no problems keeping two contradictions in my mind at the same time. So it's one thing to feel that sense of pride, but I also think that I'm capable of saying, but what is the source of that pride? So my parents, not educated, and part of their absence of education is a legacy of a certain form of education inherited from who? From the Italians. So these two things exist in the same place, right? So that sense of pride is balanced with a sense of understanding of the historical circumstances that produced that. Does that make sense? And then the other thing is, and somebody said it earlier, that the Italians built all of this. That's what I was also told growing up, that the Italians built all of the things. It was like, the majority of it was Eritrean labor. Like, we built it. Right, so when we talk about pride, there's that, as soon as I began to understand that when a lot of this stuff was taken out by the British afterwards, it was like, it was our labor that was being extracted, that was being here. So I just need to say that these things for me are all occupy second question. And the second question was what again?
How we can let people know about this
Yeah.
It's not only in Chicago, around the United States.
This is my attempt. Right? This is my answer to your question. Right? This is how I'm trying to. This is the work that I'm doing. So the exhibitions. This is the stuff that is on my materials. This is what is on my syllabus. This is what I teach. As Timothy was saying, I'm very fortunate. I'm very, very fortunate. I've had an opportunity to bring my work and to experience it in many, many, many places. These are the questions and the vantage points that come with me. So I will redirect it back again to you and to all of us who are in this room and say, there's a co-responsibility. The responsibility is not just for me. And how do I do and what do I do? The responsibility that I now say to you is, it's like, so as Timothy said, is I want to see you all at the opening. I want you to come to the symposium. I want you to come, and not just when I'm doing a show at MOCP or these various institutions. I think we have to because that for me is the other way in which we all do that labor.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you take one more?
Sure, yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
both for your presentation. Actually, 4 questions,
Ooh.
but
But
I know we have time for one, so I'll allow you to choose which
I'm
topic.
sure everybody
We have gender and history, Black Americans and their relationship to this work, the presence of missionaries in this time period, or oral history and music history. And then whichever topic, and then I can ask.
Yeah, that's
It's Pagan and she's gonna expand. Yes. Pick a topic.
oh,
Pick a topic.
this is like she's here next. Can we, I would like to, I will take the Black American for 500.
So Chicago has a fairly large Black population, in the U.S. as well. There's the Italian colonial period is in the 1930s. This is post-slavery, Jim Crow period, where you have scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Black Americans who are being drafted into World War I and World War II. And there's a time period overlap where many of them resisted. Was that something that came up in either one of your research, and especially in
scholars and these experiences that you just articulated, it's impossible to live in Chicago and not think about the dimension, the dimension of race, the dimension of Black American struggles within the context of Chicago in the United States. And also, it's the other overlap that I don't talk, it's impossible to talk about everything, right? It's impossible to talk about everything, but there are important intersections that one of the scholars is dealing with, Christina Labari-Bill, which is that there were Black American pilots who went and fought with Ethiopia against the Italian invasion, right? So,
And the main one was from Chicago.
Was from
actually.
Chicago.
The first pilot, Black pilot, yeah, same.
so it's, so I'm conscious and I'm aware and I'm informed by these histories. I've been living in the United States since 2004. So part of why it was important for me to come to the United States and to have a closer understanding of Black histories is because I felt that I was coming from a set of histories that were quite distinct, right? And so I'm not dealing with that explicitly. I'm not dealing with that explicitly in the work. And it is not to deny Ethiopia and the emergence of Ethiopia post 1936 is hugely significant to Pan-Africanism, to Black consciousness in the United States, and to international notions of solidarity of Blackness. And all of that is at the edge of all of this work. But I've chosen to focus. I've chosen to keep my focus on the areas and the topics that I've presented because I think that it is I always sort of think about it this way. It's like I come from the other side of the Atlantic occupies this mythic place. The Atlantic Ocean occupies a mythic place in how narratives and experiences of Blackness are narrated and understood within the context of North America. Part of my mandate as an artist and as a scholar is to really sort of think about other bodies of water that are part of this larger bodies of water. So that fits into this. Does that make sense? Is that evasive? You understand what I'm saying? It's impossible to deal with everything, and I wanted to center North and East Africa. That for me is I wanted to begin with the center from there. And how it radiates and connects to everything else is, I'm happy to